Oh yeah, oh yeah, oh yeah. This is my quite happy dance. Okay, the reason why I'm happy is because, granted, it's just a rumor at this point, but Sony Alpha rumors have apparently got confirmation in a rumor of a lens coming out that I have been praying for pretty much since I switched to Sony. In fact, before I switched to Sony. Because if you've followed this channel for a while, you may remember a video that I put up about 12 months ago where I went through all the lenses that I had when I was on a Canon DSLR and what I was getting rid of and what I was keeping and what I was swapping things for when switching over to Sony. And at the time, the majority of my lenses were Sigma lenses. I had the 24, the 35, the 50 and the 85mm art lenses and the 120 to 300mm sport lens. I was swapping the 24mm art for the 28mm f2. I was swapping the 50mm art for the Zeiss 55 1.8. I was swapping the 85mm art for the Sony 85 1.8. And I was swapping the sport lens for the Sony 100 to 400. And the majority of the reason why I was going for those lenses was simply to downsize my kit, because I wanted a smaller, lighter, more travel-friendly kit, which was one of the big appeals of the mirrorless cameras for me. However, I didn't swap the 35. I still have it. And the reason why I didn't swap the 35 is because there was no good alternative for me to swap to. This at the minute is the DSLR lens with the MC11 adapter on the A7 body. Now, Sigma do a native E-mount lens, but it's still the same fundamental lens. It's the same body, it's the same lens construction. All they've done is change the backplate of the lens to basically incorporate the adapter into it. So it's still the same sort of size and weight. Now, granted, this is not completely unusable. It's just a lot bigger and heavier than I would like it to be. But there's no other alternatives. Zeiss do a 35mm 1.4, which is deemed as like the flagship 35 of the Sony range. But that's still the same sort of size as this, and it's £1,000. Samyang do a much cheaper alternative, which is still a 35 1.4, but it's still the same sort of size as this, and the autofocus is questionable as well. There are smaller alternatives from Zeiss and Samyang, which are their 35mm f2.8 pancakes, which are a damn sight smaller and lighter. But for me, 2.8 is just going a little bit too far in the wrong direction. 1.4s are fine, but they come with the big cumbersome size. 2.8s in some situations are a little bit too slow. For me, for what I shoot, the 1.8 aperture, the f2 aperture, is pretty much the ideal sweet spot. So I've been hoping and praying for, pretty much since I switched, that somebody was going to be coming out with a 35 1.8. And I couldn't believe it was taking so long, because there's not a post about 35mm lenses that I don't see somebody saying they want a 35mm 1.8. And generally, lots of people agree with them. So there's a huge demand for them out there. Made worse by the fact that last year both Canon and Nikon entered the fray of the full-frame mirrorless market, and one of their first lenses that both of them announced was a 35mm f1.8. Not the flagship lenses, not L lenses, just a 35mm 1.8 in their kind of mid-tier lineup that has seemingly been really popular options for people as well. Well, the saving grace is, sounds like Sony have finally listened, because they are rumored, well, confirmed rumors, I'm not quite sure what the difference is, that they are going to be announcing a 35mm f1.8. And it's not going to be a G series lens or a G Master lens, it's going to be one of their lower level lenses. And you're probably thinking, oh well, that'll probably just be cheap plasticky crap like the 50mm 1.8 and probably not worth a dime anyway. But at least I hope that isn't going to be the case, because the 28mm f2 was a fairly cheap, lightweight lens, but still had really good image quality. The 85mm 1.8 is the perfect example. This is not a G-series lens at all. This is just a regular Sony lens. But in terms of the image quality, this is very, very close to the 85mm G Master lens. In fact, most people say that there's not really that much of a difference between the G Master and this. And I'm hoping that the 35mm is going to be somewhere around about this sort of performance. Really good, but not stupidly expensive. And what's made this more interesting is the fact that not only do we have confirmed rumors that Sony are going to be announcing the 35mm 1.8, but we also have confirmed rumors that Sigma are bringing out a new 35mm lens, but they're going the other way with it and are going for a 35mm 1.2, but designed specifically for Sony E-mount. But we also know Sigma's mentality these days, which is just sod how big and heavy the lens is, we want the absolute best image quality. And the rumors are already speculating that Sigma have stated that this lens is going to have the best MTF charts of any 1.2 lens on the market, which is going to be hard pressing considering we've had recent 1.2 lenses with pretty phenomenal performance. You only have to look at Sigma's recent release of the 40mm 1.4, which confused the living hell out of people when they first announced it, because it was so close in terms of paper specs to the 35. People were thinking, why would you want it? And then you look at the size difference. The 35mm is a pretty average size for a 35mm 1.4. The 40mm 1.4 is fucking enormous by comparison. But then you look at the test charts where people have compared up the 35 to the 40, and you can see why they've made the lens so big. The 35mm in terms of image quality is pretty bloody good, to be fair. The 40mm takes it a step even further. Not only is the center pin sharp at 1.4, but the corners are pretty much pin sharp at 1.4 as well. And I'm thinking that if Sigma are bringing out a 35mm 1.2, if you take into account the size difference between the older 35, which was their first global vision lens, versus the 40mm, which was one of their latest, how much bigger their lenses are becoming in recent years. Add the fact that you're going from a 1.4 to a 1.2, minus off the fact that you've got the shortened flange distance, I reckon the lens is probably going to be around about that same sort of size, maybe a little bit bigger, i.e. still pretty big and heavy for Sony A7 bodies. But the question is, how important is all of that going to be? How necessary is it? I mean, what is the difference between 1.2 to 1.8? Well, obviously, it's a stop of light. But is that a huge noticeable difference? I did some test shots the other day of Rusty with this lens, where I shot it at 1.4 and at 1.8. There's a slight difference with how much background blur you get, but not all that much. Now, you obviously have the other argument that you're losing 2/3 of a stop worth of light, so you're going to have to, bump up your ISO by 2/3 of a stop or slow your shutter speed down. But I'm not convinced that it's actually quite that bad. When I bought the 55 and the 85, I compared them up to their respective Sigma counterparts. And what I noticed is that with both of them, comparing to the 50mm R and the 85mm R, is that when I shot the Sigmas at 1.4 and then brought the exposures down by 2/3 of a stop and compared them up to the Sony and the Zeiss lenses, these were actually brighter. So either these are letting in more than f1.8 or the Sigmas are letting in less than 1.4. Either because they're not truly 1.4 or there's just so much glass inside absorbing some of the light that you just lose some of it anyway. But the difference between them isn't really 2/3 of a stop. It's more like maybe a half a stop, somewhere between a third and a half. It'd be interesting to see what Sigma would then get from the 1.2. Is their 1.2 going to render more like the Zeiss 35-14, or are they actually going to get brighter than a 1.4? But which would you opt for? Are you like me? Have you been waiting for a 35mm 1.8 forever and a day? Or, does the sound of a 1.2 more appealing to you? Or are you going to take advantage of the onslaught of 1.4s being sold off and get yourself a cheap 1.4? Leave your thoughts and comments in the box down below. Thank you so much for stopping by, and hopefully I will see you in the next video.